announcement. You can hear me, I believe? You can hear me? You can hear me? Okay, thank you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. Om Parthaya Pradibodhidam Bhagavata Narayanena Swayam Vyasena Gradhidam Purana Munina Madhye Mahabharatam Advaidam Radavashini Bhagavadim Ashtadashadhyayinim Ambatva Manusandadhami Bhagavad Gite Bhavadveshinim Yam Brahma Varunendra Rudramarudastunnandi Divvaistavai Vede Sankapadakramopaniषदे Gayanti Yam Samagaha Dhyana Tadgatena Manasa Pasyandiyam Yogino Yasyam Damna Vidusura Suragana Devaya Tasmai Namaha. We are continuing a discussion on the 5th verse of the 8th chapter. It's a very interesting verse and very relevant for a reason, because these three verses, 5th, 6th and 7th verses of the 8th chapter, deal with the whole philosophy of life, the whole dynamics of life. And interestingly it says, life is not all about living, life is also about dying. So it tells us how to die. Now, death is not something terrifying, something scary, something undesirable. It is a transition, it is a creative transition, it's a constructive transition. And that is something very interesting. This is a very interesting topic being discussed. So we will be able to live our life more intelligently and with greater joy and happiness if we also know the true meaning and implication of death. Well, certain Western writers, those who have interpreted Plato's dialogue, and one of them, not so well known, his name was, he was an British writer, Mr. Uric. Don't remember his full name. He has written something on Plato, and he talks about, he interprets one fraction of Plato's apology. Of course, that particular work is a dialogue between Crito and Socrates. Crito was a wealthy friend of Socrates. So the dialogue itself is called Crito. It's a dialogue. In fact, unlike Plato's other works, you don't find Plato here, you only find Socrates. In other works of Plato, there is Plato all over and Socrates sometimes invisible. But here it is Socrates for everyone to see. Now, he refers to an interesting conversation. That was when Socrates was imprisoned and he was accused of misleading youngsters by the Greeks, and so he was condemned to death and was imprisoned, and he is visited by his friends, including Crito, and there's a dialogue. So it is said that during the dialogue, Crito asked him a question, Socrates, how shall we bury you? That's the question. And Socrates replied something like this, for that you have to catch the real me. Now, very surprisingly, a British writer, interpreter, who was familiar with Vedanta, Upanishads, he says this response from Socrates can only be understood in the light of the message of the Upanishads, which teaches not only about life but also about death. Death not as something indicating the end of anything, but something that indicates the transition of a continuous journey. So that's a central thought that we have to keep in mind when we listen to these three verses. That is 5th, 6th, and 7th, and we can see that Socrates perhaps understood what now we call Vedanta philosophy from the Upanishads, as interpreted by Shankaracharya. But the Greeks did not understand it, that's why he had to die like that. So Greeks were all about physical. Socrates could think of something higher than the physical, higher than the empirical. So the verse is interesting. Antakale cha mameva smaran muktva kalebaram ye prayadi samadbhavam yadi nasti atra samseha. There is no doubt about something. What is that? Anyone who remembers me, meditates on me at the time of death, and then what he attains my real nature. He understands, he realizes my true nature, and there is no doubt about it. Now this is again related to the doctrine of the law of karma and the doctrine of reincarnation, and the verse extends itself to the next one because these are all interconnected. Yam yam vapi smaran bhavam tyajatyande kalevaram tam tamevaiti kaunteya sada madbha tad bhavam bhavidah. That is the 6th verse. A person who at the time of whatever he remembers, when he dies, whatever he remembers at the end of his life, or with what thought a person leaves his body behind, that alone is attained by him. Therefore, Lord Krishna, the teacher, is addressing his student, disciple Arjuna, you keep your thought constantly focused on me, on that particular transcendental spiritual reality. You can interpret, anyone who belongs to any religious tradition can replace that idea, well, my idea of God, or my idea of a messenger, my idea of a savior, monotheistic ideal of God, anything like that. For Buddhists can think anyone who dies with the thought of Buddha, he will attain highest spiritual liberation. Anyone who can think of God, Jesus at the time of death, any Christian can be sure he will attain his spiritual destination. So also a Jew or a Buddhist Jain who are maybe that. Now it says, essentially it says that that the central point is the real me, as Socrates understood, is not by body. But I am living in this body, but I am different from this body. I am in this body, but I am not the body. The real I am not the body. So death is nothing but the destruction of the physical body. In fact, that's why in all religious traditions which have their origin in India mostly, you find they buried a body, because body has served the purpose. Body is not kept as something to be preserved, to be kept intact. And you can see, of course, people who have read about the mummies of pharaohs, Ramses II, and many priestesses in the ancient Greek tradition. You find those mummies were mummified in the Egyptian pyramids. Those who tried to buy those mummies, those who tried to keep their mummies in their rooms. Sometimes they were involved in transporting the mummies from Egypt to England or maybe other places. They had to face a lot of troubles. They had the curse, of course. Anyway, I'm not connecting this with the other. What it means is the other side of this philosophy of life. It means this body is to be preserved. But Vedanta tells this body has served a purpose. Now you have another fresh body. Another set of body you will have. Next life. New body. Young. And this soul will be transferred to the other body. And the life will continue. Now another point is, as Sri Ramakrishna says in the Gospel, what about death? So whatever thought you have in our mind, we have in our mind at the time of death, that thought will decide and determine our next birth and next life. And Sri Ramakrishna says, he puts this idea and he uses an analogy, a comparison, of course a metaphor. If you bathe an elephant and make it cleans his body, then within minutes the elephant will make its body dirty again by putting dust all over, dust or mud, whatever it is, all over its body. The elephant doesn't recognize the importance of keeping the body clean. On the other hand, if you bathe the elephant and put it in a stable where it cannot come out and make its body dirty again by throwing mud all over, then what happens, it remains clean. Like that, at the time of death, if you can think of God or any noble idea, then there's no time for us to make our mind dirty again by doing something wrong, by speaking something wrong, by thinking something wrong. So straight away, you have got a pure mind and you begin your life. You have a good beginning with a pure mind. But to be able to think of God or to think of something sublime and transcendental, at the time of death, we should make a long preparation. I can't say I shall do whatever I want now, and at the time of death I shall have a wonderful thought. It doesn't happen like that. We can be a diplomat while dealing with others, but we cannot be very diplomatic when we deal with ourselves, our own self, in the sense our mind. We cannot, for a long time, we cannot play with our own mind. And people who have tried to do that normally have gone mad. That's interesting thing, because when we try to play with our own mind, we are putting an outer layer around our own mind, another deceptive layer, and becomes more and more complex and complicated. That's why in all religious traditions, or I mean say mystical traditions, not religion in its conventional sense, meaning higher mystical traditions, whether Christian mystics of Middle Ages or mystics of the ancient Hebraic tradition or Vedanta Hindu tradition or Buddhist tradition, you find a kind of transparency of mind. There is one central criterion for becoming spiritual, and that transparency implies an inborn incapacity to be diplomatic with ourselves. That's the idea behind. Means we cannot deceive ourselves. So whatever we do in our life, that will somehow or other will reflect at the last moment. So that's why in the Mahabharata there is an interesting verse which says, Yuvaiva dharmashilasyat anityam khalu jividam kohi janadi kasmadya mrityukalo bhavishyati. The word kala is used here. Kala in Sanskrit means time. It also means the one who consumes everything. That is also time. So that's the name of death. So the name of death in Sanskrit is Kala. And the name of time also is Kala. So it says, day and night one should practice spiritual disciplines, japa, meditation, or whatever it is. And then what happens? At the time of death, one will be able to think of something higher. Now, this can be difficult to understand for many. How can we always think of God while eating food, traveling in trains, by planes, doing our official work in the office? Can we think of God? Well, the central principle, and is elaborated in so many scriptures, is there are two ways of looking at life or looking at God. We can look at God through the eyes of the world, but that is not a very correct way of looking at God. Because when we look at God through the eyes of the world, then we will be seeing God only in terms of somebody who created this world, who's keeping a close eye on what is happening in this world, and who is very serious about creating this world. That's where we are trying to create God in our own image. Now Vedanta tells us that we should look at the world through the eyes of God. What it means is, when you look at the world from the higher transcendental point of view, from the higher perspective, then we can see everything in this world is changing. So we can live in this world, do our work, be efficient, be successful, have a wonderful job, and do everything wonderful. At the same time, remember that these things are part of a fleeting, changing, momentary phenomenon. It will change. These things belong to time, subject to change. So there is something that's beyond time, beyond change. And that is the idea of God in Vedanta. So we should look at the world through this transcendental perspective. I would like to go deeper into this subject because it will be, I think it will be injustice to leave this subject with a superficial interpretation based on the words of the Gita, because the Gita only puts things in a nutshell. But Gita is putting in a nutshell a very profound and very deep-rooted philosophical concept that will help us in our everyday life. We are not talking about death, we are talking about life. But talking about life becomes more complete and more enjoyable when we understand the limitations of what we now understand life. The understanding of life becomes complete when we understand the meaning of death also. I mentioned this in the last session. This is being discussed in many places, but the most profound discussion of this, apart from the Upanishads, is found in Shankaracharya's Brahma Sutra Bhashya. Brahma Sutra has a particular sections called Adhikaranas, Tadandara Pradipatti Adhikaranam. Those who are serious students of Vedanta, I know there are many who have studied Sanskrit and familiar with the text for their purpose, and those who are not familiar with these texts, they won't miss anything. I shall give a detailed exposition in English. So this particular section, it is the first quarter of the third chapter of Brahma Sutra. It is called Prathama Pada Tridiyodhyaya, Tadandara Pradipatti Adhikaranam. So it deals with the dynamics of departure from this body, how the soul departs from this body. So there are this discussion, it takes the form of a discussion, very similar to Plato's dialogues you find, because Shankaracharya follows the ancient Upanishad method. Now is a discussion. The discussion whether transmigration of the soul, whether the transmigrating soul moves from this body without being surrounded by the subtle elements, by the senses. With this question, I shall explain this. Of course, this should be understood in the context. I need some explanation. The discussion is this: how does the soul leave the human body? If you believe that you inherit the impressions and tendencies from your previous life, there's one problem. You don't inherit this mind from your previous life. You don't inherit these eyes from your previous life. All these are destroyed. As you know, in Vedantic tradition, to which Shankaracharya belonged, they burned the body. There is absolutely no question of the senses, the eyes, the ears, the sense of touch, sense of smell, all the senses of perception, all these accompanying the soul. It doesn't happen, it cannot happen. So the question is, how does the soul move from one body to another body? There are certain other schools of thought with whom Shankaracharya had arguments, and some of those views were not accepted by him. So those schools of philosophers, they used to believe that the senses and mind, they do not follow the body. Obviously, that is true. Now, Vedantins say, no. The senses and mind and subtle elements all follow the soul. That's why the commentary is this: Tadandara Privatto, Dehantar Privatto, Deha Bijay Buddha Sukshmehi Samparishaktaha Ramkhadi Gachadi, etc. I'm not going to read those commentaries in Sanskrit. So now here the point is, you don't inherit your mind or your eyes or your senses, because you develop, you accumulate your tendencies, your emotions from your experiences, and these experiences involve the mind, the eyes, etc. I see something with my eyes and mind, I hear something with my ears and mind, I touch something with my sense of touch and mind, I taste something with my sense of taste and mind. Without mind being involved, there is no sensation happening, and there is no experience, there is no emotion, nothing. Now the point is, these senses do not follow the physical senses, but the tendencies that are already accumulated in the mental system called chittam, those tendencies follow you when you transmigrate from one body to another body. That's what really happens. That's why people sometimes feel, when they listen to some spiritual idea, they feel a great fascination. When you listen to something, you feel, yeah, this is something which I can relate, I can connect. Your parents have not taught you Vedanta, or they didn't believe, you didn't believe also. Your parents, brothers and sisters, none of your ancestors may have believed in doctrine of reincarnation. But suddenly when you listen to these ideas, at least some, they send emails to me, but I cannot talk to them directly. Our temple reopened within 6-7 months at that time. They are most welcome to visit the Vedanta Society here. Now when we listen to these ideas, suddenly the feeling comes, it makes sense. Of course, you may not publish your agreement. You'll be called crazy in modern times. If you go to a hospital, if you talk to a friend who's a doctor, if you say you believe in reincarnation, they may call you crazy, of course. But there are certain things that people at the corner of their mind, they can relate and they feel, well, it makes sense. It seems to make sense, that feeling. That's because we have already had this experience somewhere, in some context, in some other maybe set of circumstances, but we don't know. But this is because these tendencies are inherited in our present life from some other previous life cycles. So that's the real implication of this. That's why Vedantin say that, the answer is samparishoktaha remkhadi gacchadi iti avagantavyam kutaha prasnanarupnavayam. This has been discussed elsewhere. That's the idea behind. Now another question will arise. What about returning? What about the next one, next chapter? That also is discussed in the same text. In another section of the same text, Brahma Sutra, that is Kritatya Adhikaranam. That's of course the name of the particular section in Sanskrit. And that is this return of the souls. Kridati anusayavan dushtasmatibhyam yathedam anevam cha. This is an interesting chapter. What it means is, after these actions are exhausted, after having had already exhausted the fruits of our work in this life, the soul returns together with the residual karma, the remaining karma, and this is what we understand from the Upanishads. This is the statement of this particular text. So, many of the very profound spiritual literature of Vedanta elaborately discuss these subjects. That's why in the next verse, Lord Krishna says, Yam yam vapi smaran bhavam tyajatyante kalayaparam. Therefore, with whatever thought we leave this world, with that thought we come back. But remember, there is a difference. Certain karma, certain samskara, certain impressions are to be worked out, exhausted. during this interval. Therefore, one should always try to keep some higher ideal at the corner of our mind. We have to live in this world. We cannot always think of God. Of course, there have been people who thought of God 24 hours of the day, 7 days of the week, every hour, every minute. We call them mystics, we call them great saints and sages. All traditions have produced such great people. Of course, if you take Buddhism, there is no God idea in Buddhism, but still the teachings of Buddha, his instructions, his followers, many of them, of course not all, many great Buddhists, they followed and practiced, and so Buddhism also produced great mystics and saints. That's because they prepared their life in such a way, they lived their life in such a way that even while doing their work, they always thought of some higher ideal. Again, if you go to Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, he puts in a very simple language, not the complicated language that we are discussing now. Sri Ramakrishna is very simple language, straightforward language. He says, we always want something complicated, otherwise you won't be convinced. That's an important thing. The main problem in modern times, you should sound to be something extremely profound. A profound truth put in simple language will not have any currency. The profound truth should be put in a very profound language. That's because in modern times, people put very childish, superficial ideas in profound language. So it is far better to put a profound idea in a very profound language than putting very simple, superficial, silly idea in very pompous and profound language. It's highly misleading. So Sri Ramakrishna says, if you have a toothache, and if you always think of toothache, it doesn't require much effort to be always focused on your toothache, because it always comes as a nagging reminder of the problem in the teeth. You may be working, you may be meditating, you may be teaching, you may be learning, you may be working in the office or in the factory, wherever it is. Still, that toothache will always come back to the mind as a nagging reminder, an unwelcome reminder of the problem with the tooth. Like that, if we can have a pleasant memory that God is everything and the only absolute reality, if that thought we can always keep in our mind, even while doing our everyday work, somewhere, that is wonderful. That is the idea. That's why the 6th verse tells you, yam yam vapi smaran bhavam tejatyante kalebiram tam tame vaiti kaunteya sada tadbhava bhavita. This has been described in many scriptures and classics. There's an interesting story in the Bhagavad Purana. Bhagavad Purana is the most profound devotional classic of Hindu Vedantic tradition. Very Vedantic and very profound, very philosophical. At the same time, it is the most sublime text of pure devotion. Now, how this book came to be written? There's a very interesting story. There's the story of a man who got great help from death. Death became his protector. Death became his guru. Parikshita was an ancient king, and he was well known as a noble, ideal king, a philosopher king. And one day he was traveling in forests, and he was tired, he was hungry, he was thirsty, and he saw a hut. It was the hermitage of a sage. He entered that hermitage, and he expected to be welcomed. But there was an old man, a great sage, who was sitting there completely absorbed in meditation. He did not know that this tired, exhausted king had entered the hermitage, looking for some drinking water perhaps. The sage was sitting absorbed in meditation. The king was actually well known as an ideal king, very polite, very humble, and very sensible, who normally won't get angry at anything. He was very kingly in his, and also very sagely. That was his greatness. But this time, when he was so hungry, so fatigued, so thirsty, he lost his temper. So he thought the sage was pretending to be absorbed in meditation. So instead of waiting for some time, he got angry, and what he did was something horrible. He looked around and he found a dead snake lying about outside the hermitage. He lifted the snake on his bow and then put it on the neck of the sage, who was absorbed in meditation, sitting there absorbed in meditation. Now his son came later. He came to know what happened, and his son was also a very powerful man, a spiritually enlightened person, though not very enlightened, but he had accumulated a lot of spiritual powers. He also lost his temper, so he cursed without knowing who had done this mischief. Whoever must have done this terrible thing to my father, putting this dead snake on the neck of my father, who was absorbed in meditation. This man is so arrogant, so haughty, so he deserves to die. So on the 7th day from now, he will be killed by snake bite. That was the curse that the son put on the king, without, of course, knowing that it was the king who had done this horrible deed, crime. Anyway, the king came to know of this, of the curse that he had invited upon himself. He did not get angry. He was a noble man. He thought he deserved this. I deserved this because I did something horrible, putting a dead snake on the neck of a great sage. So I deserve this punishment. So he had only 7 days to live. That was the curse. On the 7th day from now, the king will die of snake bite. He will be beaten by a snake. The king knew this. So he left his kingdom, he left his palace, and he crowned his eldest son, Janamejaya, that was the name of his son, as the next king. And he came to the banks of the holy river Ganga, sat there absorbed in meditation. What was the purpose? He wanted to know how to live sensibly the remaining 7 days. Now, interestingly, in one of the most unlikely sources, in Dostoevsky's The Idiot, you find the interesting scene where a narrator, a poor man who was sentenced to die, imagines his fantasies. Suppose he is pardoned at the last moment, how he will live for the next 10 minutes. It's interesting. In The Idiot, you find something very interesting, a parallel. Anyway, and he thinks, I shall do this, I shall do that, and so on. But it never occurs to him that he can live his life in such a way, the next 10 minutes, he can live his life in such a way that he can guarantee a good, noble life next time when he is born. Because the idea did not occur in the Russian Orthodox tradition to which Dostoevsky belonged. So anyway, I'm just giving some parallels from this. It comes in The Idiot. It's a fantasy. Some people say it is actually it's actually taken from his own personal life. Dostoevsky himself was sentenced to death, Then he was pardoned by the king, was given clemency by the Tsar. That's a different story. So coming back to the Bhagavad story, the king decided that he should live his life in such a way that he should be able to welcome with a smile when death comes. Then only life becomes complete. So life becomes complete only when we take into consideration the grandeur, the beauty and greatness of death. Then death is no more a terrifying thought. It is something that we can take in our stride. So that's the lesson we get from this. So the king remained absorbed in meditation, sitting on banks of the river Ganga, the holy river in India. The number of sages came to know of this story, and they also came, they assembled on the banks of the river because they heard about the great king, and he didn't get angry. When he came to know the curse that the youngster had put on him, he did not get angry. He did not go and take revenge on the sage and his son. Rather, he welcomed, I deserve this. That's why he was the great king. Interestingly, he was the grandson of Arjuna, whom Lord Krishna is instructing the Bhagavad Gita. So naturally, there is something great in the lineage. This Parikshita, this king we are talking about, he was the grandson of Arjuna, the disciple, the student who is listening to Krishna's instructions here. So when all the sages came, the king put some questions to them. When the great men, philosophers, saints and sages visit a king normally, or your home also, if they come, you should put them some question, some philosophical question. All the Upanishads are full of such dialogues, including Bhagavad Purana, full of dialogue, hundreds of dialogues. Maybe I would say Socrates would be happy to be part of those dialogues in the Mahabharata, Upanishads, Vedanta you find. So now, one question that he put to him was this, means, what should a dying man do if death is looking at him? So, the question is, how should a person live the rest of his lifetime? Atha prichami samsiddhim yoginam paramam gurum purusha sehayatkaryam riyamanasya sarvatha. That is the verse in the Bhagavad Purana you find. I am asking putting this question to you. What should a dying man do? The question is directly put to Shuka, who is actually the teacher whose teachings are mostly recorded in the Bhagavad Purana. And in answer to this, Shuka, the great sage, says, Edavan Sankhyoga-bhyam Sudharma Parinishthaya Janma Labha Parapumsam Ante Narayana Smriti. Comes in the next chapter, because the question continues one after another. One should be able to live this life in such a way that he should be able to leave this world with a smile on his face and with some holy thought in his mind. Janma Labha Param Pumsam, the ultimate destination, the ultimate goal of human life, all human aspirations, is to leave this world with a memory, the thought of God in our hearts. It is so universal. It's not talking about any particular deity, but any tradition can take this idea. Our life should be lived in such a way that we should be able to live this life in a very intelligent, in a very spiritual way. Then only life becomes complete. Otherwise, it will be only half well lived. That's the central message. And actually, the whole Bhagavad Purana, 18,000 verses, which contains so many profound ideas, is a response to this question from a king, from an enlightened king, who wanted to know how he should live the rest of his life, that is only 7 days, in a very intelligent, in a very spiritual manner. So, that's why Lord Krishna says, Yam yam vabi smaran bhavam tyajatyante kalevaram tam tameva iti kaunteya sada tad bhava bhavitaha. Now we will have interaction. We have 10 minutes. You are most welcome.
Swamiji, my name is Regina. I do have a question
Yeah.
about death. can you speak to the death where someone has had a violent death, like they didn't have an opportunity to think about God? What happens to the soul, to these people?
Yeah, that is a serious question. But if we live our life in such a way, then even the most difficult kind of death won't be unpleasant. I can narrate a real incident from the life of one of the disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. His name was Swami Tattwamayananda. Of course, he did not die like that, but the story is very interesting. He was returning to India, mostly returning to India, and the ship was facing a big storm, and it was a life-threatening scenario. And passengers got terrified and they were scared, because in those days, ship journey was not always safe, especially in the Mediterranean perhaps. But the Swami remained calm and quiet. So somebody asked him the reason for his calm, quiet attitude. Okay, we don't know the reason, we don't know why he could remain quiet and calm, totally peaceful. But those who have understood the reality that life really doesn't end with death, and with that attitude, if we live our life in a very in a spiritual way, whatever way possible, with some higher ideal, then it will be less unpleasant. If you talk to doctors and those who work in the hospice, nurses and others, the hospital staff, some of them will tell you, those who did not have any faith, any higher ideal, they become sometimes much disturbed when their end comes. On the other hand, those who have some solace, some higher ideal, some devotion practice, some faith, sincere faith, they are able to cope with these complicated situations, scenarios more calmly and quietly. So we need some higher ideal to guide us. That's the central point. In fact, the topic of discussion is not really death. The topic of discussion is life. Now, how to live our life in its fullness, without fear, without worry. For that, we have to understand the fact that death is not the end of everything. It's only transition. And then we will be able to enrich our life with good thoughts, good deeds, good words, and feeding our mind with more and more noble thoughts, spiritual thoughts. That will give us a feeling of encouragement. About this, the problem of violent death, all that we can say is that a person who has led a spiritual life, he won't be afraid of being totally lost, going to hell or anything. The idea of hell, as we understand in many of the Abrahamic traditions, of course, not in, especially many of the, not all Abrahamic traditions, doesn't exist in Vedanta. I mean, everyone is doomed to go to hell. No, that idea doesn't exist. We can make our own heaven here in this world through our words, our actions, being good human beings. This idea.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Swamiji, how does that relate to Jivan Mukta?
Oh yeah, Jivan Muktas, they don't worry. For them, the idea of leaving this world is not at all a subject for discussion, because a Jivan Mukta won't be born again. A Jivan Mukta won't have any more karmas to be worked out, because he has got Jivan Mukti, this liberation while living in this world. That's called Jivan Mukti. Because he has attained that, his actions will not produce further karmas or results. Karmic results will not be there. The karmic cycle has come to an end for a Jivan Mukta. He will become one with Brahman. He will be liberated from this transmigratory cycle. Of course, here we should remember the fifth, sixth, and seventh verses discuss the karmic cycles and the transmigratory cycles. Those who are still within that transmigration. But Jivan Muktas, they go beyond. They are liberated from this. That's the idea behind. We should remember the subject of discussion is not death. The subject of discussion is life. But how to live and understand our life properly, we should be able to be free from the fear that everything going to be lost. Everything. No, everything is not going to be lost. That's the idea behind. As somebody mentioned just now, one of our listeners asked this question about violent death. Those who have done a lot of good karmas, good they may have also some negative, but these good karmas will ensure that their next life cycle will be more elevated. They will get an elevated life in next life. Every good action, every good thought, every good word is like a deposit we put in the bank, spiritual bank, which guarantees that one day we will be able to draw the check, will be spiritually benefited by the deposits we are making. Any noble deed, noble thought, noble activity is like depositing a check in our spiritual bank. In modern times, the doctrine of karma and the doctrine of reincarnation, people do admit in private, but they don't really won't admit public. But that the belief can solve many problems of anxieties, depressions, and problems that people face in the hospitals. If you talk to hospice nurses, you find. I had an opportunity to visit old age homes maybe 2-3 times during the last 10 years. So I remember going, they were watching TV, and once I went, they're changing the CD. The Terminator 1 they have seen, they're now getting ready to watch Terminator 2. And they had the whole bunch of CDs, Terminator 1, 2, I don't know how many are there. No, that's not the way to put spiritual, deposit spiritual checks in the spiritual bank. Reading either, depending upon what tradition you belong to, the Sermon on the Mount, or the Torah, or Talmud, or Buddhist teachings, the Gita, the Upanishads, or the teachings of the great mystics. Or if you don't believe in God, you can still read Buddha. Buddha did not believe in God. There are many who tell you, I don't believe in religion. Okay, you don't believe in religion in the sense you don't believe in God, all right. Then you are in distinguished company. Buddha also did not believe in God. So I don't think there is anybody who is totally incapable of keeping some higher ideal in their mind. So that's why life becomes complete when we get a very creative, constructive and the positive idea of the inevitable, the unavoidable, but constantly a source of fear. Once we get this pleasant, very rational and scientific attitude towards this unavoidable and inevitable, then life becomes more livable and pleasant. Of course, I must be in a hurry to mention another important thing. All the scriptures are full of references to many great devotees of God who were saved from serious difficulties and problems by the devotion. Devotion to God is the ultimate healer. In all traditions you find this. All great traditions you find. Those who were sincere believers and devotees, they get freedom. They are totally exempted from all these difficulties, every kind of difficulty. One of our great teachers, the Holy Mother, Sharada Devi says, if you are a sincere spiritual person, the sincerity is very important. Whether you are attained higher spiritual attainments or not, it's a different matter. But if you are a sincere spiritual seeker, then if you are destined to be bitten by a snake, you will be bitten maybe by a scorpion, for which you may have to take at the most go to Kaiser and take a vaccination, that's all, injection, that's all. Nothing more will happen. If you are destined to be bitten by a scorpion, then perhaps you may be bitten by a lizard. So the intensity of sufferings, the intensity of the tragedies will be considerably reduced if the person, if he practice some spiritual discipline like devotion, but prayer, whatever it is. So now, I think, and thank you for the questions. We have no more questions. Okay. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.
Thank you.